It started with a knock that didn't echo. Not the bang of a desperate man. Not the tap of a messenger with updates. No. It was the kind of knock that made everyone in the room stop mid-sentence, not because it was loud, but because it was measured. Deliberate. Like the person behind it had already won the argument. Inside the crimson-paneled chamber of the National Transitional Council, 10 men in suits and 2 women in traditional wraps glanced at each other, uneasy. They were in the middle of a vote, well, more of a rehearsal. The decision had already been made days ago. They would move to strip Ibrahim Traoré of emergency executive powers. Quietly. Officially. Legally. They would call it a realignment. A modernization. A procedural correction. The words were already in the statement draft. But when the knock came, none of them could remember a single line. General Douamba, the council chair, cleared his throat. Come in. The door opened slowly. No bodyguards. No aides. Just him. Captain Ibrahim Traoré stepped through the doorway, eyes scanning the room not like a soldier or a politician, but like a man walking into his own funeral, aware, amused, and utterly unafraid. He wore no insignia today, just a charcoal gray fatigued uniform without medals, no sidearm, no folder, no tablet. Even his boots didn't squeak. And he didn't say a word. One of the older councillors, Minister Benoit Tapsoba, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Captain. We weren't expecting. Ibrahim raised a single hand. Not a wave. Not a command. Just a gesture. Tapsoba's voice trailed off. His lips kept moving, as if the rest of the sentence was still forming in his mind, but no sound came. A pin could have dropped. Even the air conditioning seemed to hesitate. Ibrahim moved to the center of the room, where the large oval table framed a digital projection of the national reform document. He stood at the edge of the light, casting a long shadow across the table. Still silent. Still unmoving. Councillor Fadila Sour tried to regain control of the meeting. Captain, this session is classified. There are matters. He turned his head slightly, just slightly, and locked eyes with her. That's when something strange happened. She sat down. Not with defiance. Not in protest. But as if something deep in her chest had shifted, like a string tied to her integrity had just been tugged back into place. Outside, the capital was tense. Rumors had been spreading for days, French envoys flying in without press coverage, secret meetings at midnight, documents burned, and men in uniforms asking strange questions at checkpoints. The people smelled it. The old elite smelled it. Something was coming. But no one expected this, for Traoré to walk into the council chamber alone. And still say nothing. Councillor Karamoko leaned toward the others and whispered, "Is this intimidation? What is this?" Traoré blinked slowly. His eyes moved to Karamoko like a lion lazily noting which gazelle limps. Then he drifted, forward, until he stood directly behind his own empty seat. The seat marked with the golden seal of the transitional presidency. He didn't sit. He didn't need to. His silence filled the room more than any speech ever could. Every person at that table had sat in closed-door meetings over the last few weeks. Every one of them had taken a call from an ambassador, a financier, or a general. Every one of them had considered what it would mean to push him aside, surgically, politely, with bureaucratic gloves. None of them had predicted that their biggest obstacle would be a man who didn't speak at all. General Douamba coughed again. "Captain Traoré, if you have come here to disrupt this meeting." Ibrahim raised one eyebrow. Slowly. As if he were inviting Douamba to try again. To choose a different word. To tread more carefully. The air changed. Not the temperature, something deeper. The moral oxygen in the room thinned. For the first time in years, the councillors felt like students called into the office of a headmaster who already knew what they had done. Ibrahim looked to the far wall, where the national flag of Burkina Faso hung beside the founding documents of the republic. Then he lowered his gaze, to the ground beneath it. There, barely noticeable, was a set of scuffed floorboards, each one cracked from years of heel pounding during dramatic speeches and rushed exits. But Ibrahim stared at it like it was the site of a crime scene. Then he looked back at the council. And finally, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. No seal. No watermark. Just one line of handwriting. He placed it gently on the center of the table. No flourish. No speech. Then he turned. And walked out. As soon as the door closed behind him, the room exhaled like a balloon punctured by a silent needle. Minister Tapsoba stood and rushed toward the document. His hands trembled. He unfolded the paper. It read. The next time I speak, it will be from the barracks. Or the grave. Silence. Then a ripple of realization. Councillor Fadila whispered, he knows. General Duamba nodded slowly, face pale. He knows everything. Councillor Karamoko stood, pushed back his chair, and without a word, left the room. Then another followed. And another. By the end of the hour, 7 seats were empty. No resignations were announced. No statements released. Just men and women walking out of a room with the weight of judgment on their backs, and the sound of a man who never had to raise his voice. The silence had spoken. And it had won. The following morning, only one person returned to the council chamber. General Duamba. He stood alone by the same seat he'd held for 6 years, longer than most had served in silence and twice as long as the Constitution allowed. The other chairs remained eerily empty, their data pads dark, their nameplates untouched. The national flag no longer looked proud behind him. It looked like a backdrop for a trial that had no judge. He hadn't slept. On his desk sat 2 phones. One buzzed every few minutes with calls from Paris. The other, his secure military line, had been silent since last night. He hadn't dared touch either. When the chamber door creaked open again, it wasn't a counselor. It wasn't a journalist. It was Ibrahim. Same uniform. Same boots. No papers this time. Just him. But today, he sat directly across from Duamba. No words. Just the sound of old leather groaning under pressure as he leaned back into the seat marked President. Duamba finally spoke. His voice was thin, raw. You didn't have to scare them like that. Ibrahim said nothing. They're not traitors, you know, Duamba continued. They're cowards, yes. Opportunists, maybe. But they weren't going to harm you. Still no answer. Duamba tapped the armrest, his fingers jittery. They were going to vote, Ibrahim. They had the numbers. You could have let it play out. Challenged it. But walking in like that, like a ghost, what did you think would happen? Ibrahim tilted his head slightly. Not dismissive. Not amused. Just aware. You wanted to humiliate them. Ibrahim finally spoke. Just 2 words. I warned them. Duamba blinked. His hand moved toward the drawer on his right. Ibrahim's eyes followed it. No weapon, Duamba said, a half-smile twitching across his lips. Not that stupid. It's a folder. He pulled out a sealed brown file and placed it carefully on the table between them. You know what's inside? Ibrahim didn't answer. Duamba leaned forward. Testimony. Witnesses. Payments. Offshore accounts. Everything tied to the international logistics contracts we approved for security operations. Ibrahim's jaw flexed once. Duamba nodded. You were right. I knew something stank. I just let it happen. He paused. You think silence makes you holy? It doesn't. It makes you terrifying. And not everyone follows fear forever. Ibrahim's voice returned, flat and controlled. I don't lead through fear. Then what was last night? Duamba demanded, voice rising for the first time. What do you call walking into a room of elders and peeling off their conscience without saying a word? Ibrahim stood. Took the folder. Didn't open it. You think I came here to prove a point, he said. I didn't. Then why? I came to watch who would run. And who would stay. Duamba's eyes narrowed. And now that you know. Ibrahim walked to the window, gazing out over Ouagadougou. The city was quieter than usual. Markets opened late. Radios buzzed with rumors. Military convoys had moved in the dark, positioning themselves along roads that hadn't seen armor in months. Something was shifting in the bones of the nation, and everyone felt it. I spent the last year trying to heal a bleeding nation, Ibrahim said quietly. But I forgot that before healing a wound, you have to drain the rot. He turned around, the morning light cutting across half his face like a scar. You stayed. Duamba almost laughed. I'm too old to run. No, Ibrahim said. You stayed because you remember what this country was like before you were given power. The silence between them now was different. Not hostile. Not performative. Reflective. Duamba broke it with a sigh. I should have resigned with the rest. You still can. But if I do, he said, voice barely above a whisper, who will protect you from the next silence? Ibrahim studied him for a long time. Then, unexpectedly, he reached across the table and slid the folder back. Burn it. Duamba frowned. But. Not yet. Not now, Ibrahim said. But when the time comes. When we can name names and have a country strong enough not to collapse when it hears the truth. Duamba leaned back, exhausted. You're asking for faith in a system that hasn't deserved it in years. I'm asking, Ibrahim said slowly, for you to become something more dangerous than a loyalist. Duamba raised an eyebrow. What? A witness. And with that, Ibrahim left again. 2 hours later, the resignations began to pour in. Officially this time. Quiet, printed, sanitized letters, typed from across the continent. Some blamed fatigue. Others, new opportunities. A few claimed medical complications. But the people knew. They all knew. And before the sun reached the city center, another name, one the people had long suspected, appeared on a resignation notice. General Duamba. Attached was a note scribbled in black pen. I was there. I watched. And I chose to stay. May history judge me for it. But what the people didn't know, what no one outside the chamber had seen, was that Ibrahim never smiled. Not once. Because to him, victory had no celebration. Only the next threat. And it had already begun moving in the shadows. They thought the purge was over. But the true threat didn't come from inside the council. It came from a man with a brown envelope and a calm smile. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't a politician. His name wasn't on any government registry. He had no security clearance, no chain of command. But he had the Prime Minister's handwriting. The envelope arrived at Ibrahim's residence at dusk, hand-delivered by a courier who didn't ask for identification. He simply placed it in the hands of one of Traoré's aides and left without a word, blending into the crowd like a man who knew he had done his job too well. Ibrahim opened it alone. Inside, a single photo. 3 men sitting in a hotel suite in Abidjan. Wine glasses on the table. One of them was a former minister who had just retired. Another was a French diplomatic attaché. And the third. Ibrahim's eyes froze. The third man was Colonel Sidiki Bamba, head of the Internal Defense Directorate. A man Traoré had personally elevated 2 months ago. A man who was supposed to be in the north, conducting anti-insurgency operations. Behind the photo, a single page. Printed in fine type. It was a wire transcript. If he doesn't back down, we force the withdrawal. Use the attack in the east as the pretext. Blame it on his incompetence. The West will support us, Traoré's stubbornness will make him disposable. No blood, just strategy. There was no signature. No threat. Just proof. Ibrahim didn't curse. Didn't breathe hard. He simply stared at the paper for a long time, then folded it back, as if tucking away a chapter of his own betrayal. And that night, he vanished from the capital. No one saw the convoy leave. No satellite tracked it. No orders were issued. But by the next morning, he was 400 kilometers north, in a dry, wind-blown village outside Djibo, an old front line in the war against insurgents. There, in the courtyard of a school-turned-command post, sat Colonel Siddiqui Bamba. Laughing over tea with two junior officers, his rifle slung low and his uniform dusty. He didn't expect to see Ibrahim. Not in this place. Not this soon. But when the shadows shifted and the guard stiffened, Bamba stood up too late. Ibrahim walked straight through the gate. Alone. The air thickened. The younger officers stepped back instinctively as if they'd just witnessed a ghost step through flame. "Captain," Bamba started, his voice uncertain. "We weren't expecting." Ibrahim didn't speak. He pulled the envelope from inside his coat. Held it up like a flag of accusation. Bamba looked at it. Then, almost arrogantly, smirked. "You came all the way here for a photo?" Ibrahim said nothing. "You don't understand how this works, do you?" Bamba stepped closer. "You think you can outmaneuver a machine built decades before you wore a uniform? You're a soldier, not a strategist." Ibrahim lowered the envelope and looked at the junior officers nearby. "Leave us." They didn't question. They didn't hesitate. They walked, fast. Only Bamba and Ibrahim remained in the silence. "You don't have a tape," Bamba said. "You don't have a name on that transcript. This isn't court. You have nothing." Ibrahim looked around the courtyard. Wind tossed dust through the trees. A tin can rolled. Then he pulled out his sidearm. Not to point it. Not to threaten. He laid it on the table. Between them. "I'm not here for court," Ibrahim said. His voice was quiet. "I'm here for choice." Bamba's smirk faltered. "You served with me in Kaya," Ibrahim continued. "You watched men die beside us. You knew what we were building. And I saw what you were breaking," Bamba shot back. "You declared war on everyone, the French, the financiers, the bureaucrats. You think the people will eat loyalty? You're tearing apart the only alliances that kept this country afloat." Ibrahim stepped forward, just one pace. "What did they offer you?" he asked softly. "Land? A new rank? Your own militia?" Bamba's nostrils flared. "A seat at the table when this country becomes governable again. When the child king is gone and real men are left to clean up." Ibrahim looked down at the weapon on the table. Then back at Bamba. "I'm not going to arrest you," he said. "You'll walk away from here tonight. But you won't command a single soldier after this." Bamba laughed bitterly. "You don't get to make that call." Ibrahim turned, calmly. "Watch me." By morning, Colonel Siddiqui Bamba had returned to the capital. But his office had been sealed. His files, confiscated. His key cards, deactivated. No charges were filed. No announcements made. But everyone knew. The man with the smirk had walked into the fire, and been burned without a single flame. Ibrahim returned to Ouagadougou quietly. As quietly as he'd left. And when he walked back into his office, there was a single piece of paper waiting on his desk. "We know what you did in Djibo. That was not a trial. This is a warning. Step down before you leave us no options." It was unsigned. But the watermark on the paper was European. The war wasn't coming. It had already begun. And this time, it wouldn't be fought with rifles. But with narratives. The next week felt like a lifetime. Western newspapers, once silent on Burkina Faso's struggles, suddenly erupted with headlines. Burkinabé strongman strips officials of power in shadow purge. Traoré accused of silencing democracy. Civilian rule in jeopardy as West withdraws key aid. It was coordinated. Too clean. Too fast. Within 72 hours, 3 international aid agreements were suspended. Satellite internet in several northern regions mysteriously went down. IMF delegates postponed a development conference in Ouagadougou without notice. And in the capital, fear began to whisper in corridors again. But Ibrahim remained quiet. He didn't release a statement. He didn't hold a press conference. Instead, he visited schools in Kédougou. Sat with village elders in Saba. Broke bread with soldiers at remote checkpoints. Wherever he went, he brought no camera crew. Only a notebook. He listened. And the people, especially the young, watched with growing confusion. The world called him a dictator. But dictators didn't wait patiently to speak last in a village hut. They didn't hand a schoolboy a ball and ask him what peace felt like. Still, the pressure mounted. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the marble spires of the presidential annex, Ibrahim entered a darkened strategy room beneath the capital. There, 4 trusted officers waited. One of them was Captain Jamila Cohn, head of civil intelligence. A woman whose gaze could cut through deception like a scalpel through silk. She spoke first. "There's a campaign running against you in 5 languages." Ibrahim nodded once. "They're not targeting your policies," she continued. "They're targeting your silence. They're saying you're hiding something. That the reason you don't speak is because you can't defend your actions." Major Umar added, "The French ambassador is lobbying ECOWAS to demand a transitional exit plan by year's end. If you refuse, sanctions." Ibrahim looked at the map on the wall. It was pinned with red and blue markers: insurgent activity, Allied checkpoints, aid routes. But now, the biggest threats weren't in the forests. They were in the airwaves. "What do we do?" Umar asked. Ibrahim finally spoke. "We don't explain." The officers looked at each other. "You want us to stay silent?" Jamila said. "Captain, with respect, silence worked in the council chamber. But this is the world stage." "I know," Ibrahim replied. He walked to the far end of the table and opened a leather folder. Inside were dossiers, not of enemies, but of witnesses. Journalists. Farmers. Teachers. Soldiers. Men and women who had been in the room when corruption was stripped bare. People who saw it for what it was. "We don't talk," Ibrahim said. "We let others talk for us." "You want to weaponize testimony?" Major Umar asked, skeptical. "I want the people to speak before politicians steal their voice again," Ibrahim replied. A pause. Jamila nodded. "Then we start with the schools. The students in Kaya, Bobodai Lasso, Gawa. They remember what came before you. And the widows of soldiers who never got pensions until you forced it through parliament," Umar added. Ibrahim looked at them all. No scripts. No slogans. No hashtags. Just truth. It was a gamble. Silence had worked in rooms filled with cowards. But now he would need silence to invite honesty. 3 days later, a single video was released. No logo. No title. A widow, standing in front of her home in Sapui, spoke to a local camera crew. "My husband died in 2019. They promised compensation. I filled out forms, stood in line, waited 4 years. Nothing. Then one morning, a man came here. No cameras. No guards. Just him. He listened. And 3 weeks later, I received the money, without begging, without a bribe." Then another video surfaced. A teacher in Banfora. Then a soldier. Then a street vendor. None of them mentioned Ibrahim's name. But every story pointed to a single shadow, one that intervened quietly, restored dignity, and disappeared again. The West didn't understand. How do you fight a man who doesn't promote himself? How do you accuse a man who won't defend himself? How do you silence a leader whose greatest weapon is making other people speak? And then the twist came. On a warm Monday morning, a delegation from ECOWAS arrived unannounced at Ouagadougou airport. Their demand, a televised negotiation with Traoré. International journalists were summoned. Cameras were aligned. Translators prepared. It would be the perfect trap. Either Ibrahim bowed to their deadlines, or they would call him a tyrant refusing dialogue. The press waited. The ECOWAS officials sat stiffly at the long diplomatic table. And then the door opened. Ibrahim entered. He nodded. Then sat. But didn't speak. A full minute passed. Then two. The journalists fidgeted. Finally, one ECOWAS envoy leaned forward and said with forced calm, "Mr. President, we hope you understand this is a meeting of great urgency." Ibrahim didn't reply. Instead, he slid a tablet across the table. On the screen, a video began to play. It was a secretly recorded clip. 3 men in a luxurious suite in Accra. One voice clearly saying, "If we destabilize Ouagadougou fast enough, the mining contracts can be renegotiated. Just give it a week of chaos." The screen went black. No names were shown. No faces exposed. Just voices. And everyone recognized them. The ECOWAS envoy's face dropped. One journalist let out a sharp breath. Ibrahim Traoré stood slowly. Looked at the room. And left. No statement. No speech. Just silence. And the war of narratives collapsed like a paper crown in rain. The silence didn't just survive the storm. It became the storm. By the time the ECOWAS delegation boarded their private jet back to Abuja, they weren't muttering threats. They were silent too, carrying with them a realization far more dangerous than any dossier. They couldn't predict him. They couldn't pressure him. They couldn't own him. Because Ibrahim Traoré didn't play the game, they did. He simply stood still while their own movements exposed them. In Paris, diplomatic analysts scrambled to reassess their strategy. The Traoré method, they began calling it in backroom conversations. A leader who weaponized restraint. A commander who understood that in a world deafened by shouting, silence is rebellion. But for Ibrahim, it was never a strategy. It was a vow. The story had begun long before that infamous council meeting. Long before he ever wore a captain's uniform. Before war. Before state funerals and failed promises. It began in a small village in the west, where his father, a schoolteacher, once told him, "If your words cost less than your silence, you're not ready to speak." Now, he carried that lesson like a blade. The day after the ECOWAS ambush collapsed, something extraordinary happened. Ministers, real ministers, those few who had stayed, began reporting a strange trend. Military outposts that hadn't heard from the capital in weeks were sending back handwritten letters of loyalty. Student groups were organizing cleanup drives and book exchanges, without funding, without command. In the northern towns, militia groups once skeptical of the state had begun asking to integrate into the regular army. No order had been issued. No decree passed. Something else had moved them. Faith. Not in a man. In what he refused to become. And then the final test arrived. Not in the form of a bomb. Or an assassin. But a meeting request. From the president of a bordering West African nation, one who had publicly denounced Ibrahim for months. He asked to meet as heads of state and as brothers. The protocol team braced for another trap. But Ibrahim surprised them again. He accepted. No entourage. No TV cameras. Just a private drive to the borderlands. The meeting took place in a quiet lodge overlooking a river, 2 armed guards, 1 translator, and 2 men who had both seen too many coffins covered in flags. The visiting president was the first to speak. "I underestimated you," he said, sipping bitter tea. "We thought you were a zealot. An idealist with a rifle. But what you've done, this shadow resistance, has reshaped everything." Ibrahim said nothing. "You humiliated ECOWAS. They'll never admit it, but they're recalibrating. You've become a symbol. Still nothing. The president leaned forward. But symbols are dangerous, Captain. They invite fire. And if you burn, your country burns with you. So I came here to ask, what do you really want? Ibrahim set his cup down. Then finally, he spoke. Not in slogans. Not in warnings. But in a voice soft, grounded, and tired. I want to stop attending funerals for men who never owned a passport. Who died protecting borders drawn by hands that never lived here. I want our children to speak truth without fear of exile. I want generals who sleep in villages, not embassies. And I want silence to mean peace again, not betrayal. The president stared at him, quieted. Then slowly nodded. And extended a hand. No document signed. No headline. But when Ibrahim returned to the capital, everything had changed. Within weeks, 3 more regional leaders reached out. Diplomatic embassies resumed operations, carefully, respectfully. Military desertions dropped. Foreign intelligence sources confirmed that French private military contractors had pulled out of at least 2 border regions. But the most powerful moment came one morning when a child, barefoot, holding a cardboard sign, stood at the gate of the National Assembly. It read, "We don't need you to talk. Just don't leave us." That image went viral, not because of Ibrahim's reaction. But because he didn't react at all. He simply walked past, placed a hand on the child's shoulder, and entered the building without saying a word. And inside, the chamber was full again. Not with the old faces. But with new ones. Teachers. Farmers. Medics. Veterans. People who had come not to rule, but to represent. And they stood when he walked in. All of them. Because they understood something the world had failed to grasp. Sometimes the loudest thing a leader can do, is not speak. Because silence, when earned, becomes judgment. It becomes memory. It becomes the space where truth is undeniable. That night, in a room lit only by one candle and the hum of distant traffic, Ibrahim sat alone with an open journal. He wrote a single sentence. When history forgets our names, let it remember our silence. Then he closed the book. Not with finality. But with peace. Because the war had ended not with a bullet. Not with a speech. But with a moment. When a man walked into a room, said nothing. And made an entire regime collapse from the weight of its own shame.